All right. Are the Gospels historically accurate? So, like any good philosopher, my first job is to define my terms. What do I mean by historical accuracy? And in the past, I have defined this as what I call the reportage model, but that does not mean anything technical, anything hard to understand. I just mean by that literal historical accuracy, not as opposed to some kind of theological truth that's conveyed by non historical narratives. So I'm not talking about a case where someone would say, well, yes, the gospel author changed that or he made it up, but it's still true because it conveys a historical or it doesn't convey historical literal truth, but it conveys a theological truth. That's not what I mean. Now, a simple definition of the reportage model of the Gospels is that the authors were trying to get it right historically, that they were highly successful because they were close to the facts. So we could call this historical accuracy or historical reliability. How, you might therefore ask, does reportage um, relate to traditional inerrancy? Are they automatically the same? Well, traditional inerrancy entails what I mean by reportage, but the opposite doesn't necessarily apply. Reportage doesn't entail traditional inerrancy. So it's impossible to be a traditional inerrantist about the Bible and in particular about the Gospels, the historical narratives, without accepting reportage. But in theory, it's possible to accept the reportage model while not being a traditional inerrantist. And a simple Venn diagram illustrates this pretty well. Here you have the reportage model. Traditional inerrancy is entirely inside of the reportage model. So anybody who's a traditional inerrantist accepts reportage. But there's space outside where, in principle, it would be possible to accept this reportage model while having some minor and what I call good faith errors. But I want to emphasize the reportage model does entail that the gospel authors never deliberately made anything up historically or changed anything historically. So if there were any errors, if you were in this space here, they would be what I call good faith errors. They would be mere accidents, and they would need to be fairly trivial and not great in number. Okay, so that's enough for the definition of the term of historical accuracy. Now, is the historical accuracy of the Gospels is an inference to the best explanation. And that's something that philosophers and especially epistemologists are very interested in, inference to the best explanation. And we infer that they are historical reportage, that they are historically accurate from a variety of data that I'll be giving you examples of today. And I want to emphasize this is not just to say that they have historical truth in them. Keep your ears and eyes open. Sometimes you will listen to debates or discussions of the historical reliability of the Gospels, and you will hear the speaker say, there's a lot of historical truth in the Gospels. But that's not the same thing as saying that in a holistic way that they are historically accurate, not just because that might call the speaker's inerrancy into question, but because that speaker might think that the authors sometimes made things up, but that we can mine out, as it were, historical truth using what are sometimes called the criteria of authenticity. And that's not all that I mean. What I mean is that you're coming to it, and the prima facie case, once you've defended the idea that they're historically accurate, is that if something is asserted, it is historically true. That's not to say it's an indefeasible case, but you don't have to go passage by passage and say, I'm going to reset my confidence to agnosticism and start all over? Do I have a special criterion of authenticity satisfied by this passage? It's more holistic than that. We could talk about that more in the question and answer if you're interested. Well, what broad kinds of evidence do we have for a yes answer that yes, the Gospels are historically reliable? Usually, this is divided into what we call external evidence and internal evidence. External would be evidence from things like independently attested customs, archaeology, geography, inscriptions, that kind of thing, where we're going to other sources and then we're checking this with what we find in the Gospels. Internal evidence, which we're going to talk about quite a bit today, perhaps even more than external, would be evidence from the ways in which these documents casually confirm one another and casually resemble the ways that we know that truthful people report. So, what we're finding here, we are getting input from our other knowledge for internal evidence, but it's more generally our other knowledge of how truthful people talk and what truthful reportage sounds like and how truthful people's testimony tends to confirm one another. And this is an area that's much less explored when you hear people talk about gospel truth and gospel reliability. And I've been trying, and my husband Tim McGrew has been trying to bring in more understanding of internal evidence. There were writers in the 1800s that did a lot of this, but from the 1900s up to the present, it's been much less explored, and we're trying to revive that. Now, what kind of external confirmations are the best? Sometimes you'll hear people talk about big names. They'll say, well, look, Herod the Great is mentioned, or Caesar Augustus is mentioned. And everybody knows about Herod the Great and Caesar Augustus. So that's a good historical confirmation. Well, that's not necessarily very strong because Herod the Great was so well known that it would be easy to just insert his name. Or skeptics or even Christians will sometimes say, well, do we find any explicit non biblical sources mentioning the darkness when Jesus was crucified or the feeding of the 5,000 or that kind of thing? Well, if we don't find that, then that's not very good. But actually, the strongest confirmations are those that are more incidental, more casual, and hard to get right. It's important to remember that we live in an information age. We can look things up, and even prior to the internet, my memory does go back that far to prior to the internet. You could go to the library and you could get an atlas and look up matters of geography if you wanted to write a historical novel or something like that. You could look up the customs of a certain group of people, and you can certainly do that now very easily. But the gospel authors had none of that. They had nothing like that. So if they were making things up, if they were faking things, um, they couldn't just go look them up somewhere and weave them into their narratives. If they know about details of culture, geography, and small things like that, that was because they were immersed in the place and time themselves. It's also important to remember that with the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 AD, many of those things radically changed almost immediately because the priests were wiped out. The sacrifice system in Jerusalem was wiped out. So, in this region of the world, there was this abrupt sword that came down and cut off the past from the future. And so the authors turn out to be very immersed in the pre 70 culture, and that's very impressive. So let's get to some examples of what I mean by this. John 5:2 talks about the Pool of Bethesda where Jesus healed the lame man and mentions in passing, in a casual way, casualness is so important for confirmation, that it had 5 porches or 5 porticos. Well, that was all destroyed. One critic in the early 20th century, a liberal critic, suggested that John made up the five porches as a symbol for the five books of Moses that uh, Jesus supposedly superseded. But that's false. Archaeologists have found the probable remains of the Pool of Bethesda, and they have found four porches, or at least the foundations of four porches around the edges and one across the middle, five porticos. Evidence that that was just what it was like. John's just remembering what it was like and just mentioning this in passing. Incidental confirmation. Bethany and Jerusalem. John 11:18 incidentally, casually says that the little village of Bethany was close to Jerusalem. It says about 15 furlongs, which we would call in English about 2 miles. We have an ancient village there, Al Isaiah, known from ancient times as the place of Lazarus, and it turns out it is just about this distance from Jerusalem. Why does John bring it up? He's just explaining why so many of the friends of Mary and Martha had come to console them and keep them company. So again, it's casually introduced as part of the story, and we have external confirmation of it. Luke 3:2 is listing, actually Luke 3:1 through 3, is listing a lot of rulers at the time of the beginning of John the Baptist's ministry. So in that sense, it's not casual. He's placing John the Baptist's ministry into a very firm historical context, illustrating and indicating his historical intent. But he definitely mentions both great and small rulers. And I could go on about just those verses in a way that we don't even have time for, about obscure rulers that he mentions there as well. And he mentions the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas as though they were high priests simultaneously. This has been said to be a mistake by skeptics because in the Old Testament it looks like there was only one high priest at a time, and as though the high priest ruled lifelong. But we find the Jewish historical author Josephus telling us that the Romans would appoint and remove the Jews' high priests, sometimes after very brief periods of time, sometimes after longer periods of time, because they regarded it as a political office. And Josephus himself uses the plural term high priests to refer to two living people at the same time. Not Annas and Caiaphas, though he does mention them, but two high priests shortly after the time of Christ. But he shows that in a first century context, that term high priests could be and was used in the plural to refer to two living people, just the way that Luke does. Again, an incidental confirmation. And there's so much more. I've just scratched the surface here of the many types and instances of incidental confirmations. My publisher, DeWard Publishing, has just started sending to potential reviewers a new book called Testimonies to the Truth, where I have more on incidental confirmations. And Lord willing, I hope that will come out in 2023. I'd like to move now to internal evidence and talk about some categories of what we call internal evidence. Now, internal evidence sometimes involves comparisons between the documents of the Bible, the canonical books. So it's internal to them. Though we should remember that the biblical books are separate books. So in that sense, if they are confirming one another, they weren't all written by the same person. I'm going to list some categories here, and then I'm going to be giving examples of most of these categories. Undesigned coincidences, I'll explain that in a moment. Unexplained allusions, unified characters, asides, and then a little bit more self explanatory, unnecessary details, and vividness in scenes. Those last two will be two categories that I won't probably be getting to today. So I want to give an example of each of these. But before I give examples, I want to talk about the theory that this is hyper realistic fiction. The minute you start giving these internal evidences, you will find skeptics and unfortunately sometimes some Christians as well, implying that there were genres available that were they were fiction, but they were realistic. And so therefore, this is just the gospels adding things to look realistic. But when you do read the genres available at the time, there wasn't hyper realistic fiction. There was fiction. Um, and it would occasionally add, a real location or a real ruler, but it was very different from modern hyper realistic fiction. It tended to be what we call purple prose. In literature, we refer to purple prose because it would be what we in America would call over the top. It would go on and on, let me tell of the many beauties that were there that day, and so on and so on and so on. Melodramatic. But the Gospels also don't look like modern realistic fiction either. Even that modern realistic fiction that didn't come into vogue for about 1700 more years, it also doesn't look like that. In modern realistic fiction, you'll find a certain consistency. So if a author is going to describe how a person picked up his glass of water and put his glass of water down, and he spoke in this tone of voice and that tone of voice, that will tend to be maintained consistently throughout a scene, for example, or even throughout the entire work. But the Gospels don't do that either. Instead, these realistic details will jump out momentarily, and then they'll be dropped again. This falls into what I call the Goldilocks zone. Goldilocks, you may remember, was the little girl in the story of the three bears, and some of her some of the things she tried to eat in the bear's house were too hot, and some were too cold, but the ones that she liked were just right. So they fall into the Goldilocks zone, so that they are just right. They're realistic in the way that memoirs and oral history are realistic. They don't resemble either ancient or modern history. So if you listen to the way just a person who's telling a story naturally tells a true story of something that happened to him, suddenly a detail, maybe a completely irrelevant detail, will be something he remembers and throws in there, and then he'll go back to just telling the story. And you want to train your ear to hear this in the Gospels as you read and listen to them. So let me give an example of an undesigned coincidence. I'll only have time to give one example, uh, maybe two, of each of these. An example here would be an undesigned coincidence between John and Luke. In John 18, Jesus is speaking to Pilate, and Pilate asks him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight." Um, this explains something that's a little curious in Luke 23, verse 4. In Luke 23, they accuse Jesus of saying that he's the king of the Jews. The uh, rulers and chief priests say that to Pontius Pilate. And Pontius Pilate goes and examines Jesus, and he says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "You said it." Sounds like he's even affirming it. And he certainly doesn't seem to be denying it. And then Pilate turns around and he walks back out and he says, "I find no fault in him." That's curious. Jesus doesn't even seem to deny the charge. And yet Pilate says, "I find no fault in him." Why does he find no fault in him? As the Roman procurator, he should be taking this more seriously. John 18 fills out that dialogue. It gives more information. Jesus explains his kingdom is a religious kingdom. It's not an earthly kingdom. Now we see why Pilate says, I find no fault in him. Now, there are dozens more of these, both among the Gospels and between Acts and Paul's letters. The confirmation of Acts is indirectly confirmation of the truthfulness of Luke because Acts and Luke were written by the same person. That's undeniable. I've written a book, a whole book, just on undesigned coincidences called Hidden in Plain View. If you want to see many more of these, we even get them between the synoptic gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which is very important for our understanding of what's called the synoptic problem. See that for many more. Now, I want to give an example of what I mean by an unexplained allusion. In John 2:12, the narrator has just finished narrating the marriage at Cana, where Jesus has turned water into wine. He's just about to start narrating the story of Jesus' disturbance in the temple at the feast of the Passover. And in between those, he drops this one verse, just drops it in there, John 2:12, that doesn't seem to fit with anything else. It says, Jesus and his mother and his brothers and his disciples went down to Capernaum, and they stayed there for a few days. Full stop. Nothing more. He doesn't say why they went there. Was the son on their way to Jerusalem? But he hasn't mentioned yet that Jesus was on his way to Jerusalem. Why did they stay a few days? What were they doing there? What was this about? No explanation. If you listen to people talk who are telling, especially about something that happened a long time ago, they will suddenly drop little irrelevant, unexplained things in there. Someone might say, and I took Jennifer to the doctor that day. And then he'll go on with his story. And we don't find out was Jennifer his daughter or his niece or his pet or, anything. And then he'll just go on telling you about the car accident that he had that day or something like that. That's an unexplained allusion. We find many of these, especially in the Gospel of John, which is especially interesting because John claims to have been written by an eyewitness, and that's how an eyewitness talks. Very, very interesting. But we find them in other places as well. We find them in Acts as well. I want to give an example now of what I've called an aside. Now, what I mean by an aside is when the author stops and he breaks off telling you what a person was saying. Usually it's what Jesus was saying. And then he explains, but he explains in his own voice, the voice of the narrator. We have an example here in Mark 7:19. Jesus has just been saying, it is not what goes into a man that makes him unclean, but it's what comes out of the man's heart that makes him unclean. It's, you know, the evil that is in man's heart that makes him unclean. Because you see, the religious leaders were criticizing Jesus' disciples because they ate without washing their hands, which was very important in Jewish culture. And he says it's not eating without washing your hands that makes you unclean. And the author, the narrator, suddenly stops and says, by this he declared all foods clean. Now, if you read the book of Acts and even Paul's letters, you'll see that what you were allowed to eat and what you weren't allowed to eat was a big issue in the early church because of the Gentiles being incorporated into the family of God. So Mark, the narrator, is applying Jesus' words to his own situation to the situation in the early church, but he doesn't put it into Jesus' mouth. He doesn't make or have the historical Jesus say, therefore, all foods are clean. No, he says it in his own voice. Now, what this shows is that the scholars are wrong who think that the gospel authors thought, oh, well, we're inspired by the Holy Spirit, so we're allowed to make the historical Jesus say our interpretations. No, even though they thought they were inspired by the Holy Spirit, they still distinguished between the words of the historical Jesus and their own interpretations. There are many of these, again, especially in John, which is very notable because who is it that tells us that Jesus said that the Holy Spirit would come to the disciples and bring things to their remembrance and teach them all things? That's found in the words of Jesus in John. And it's John in particular for whom scholars often cast doubt on the literal truth of his reportage of Jesus' words. But it seems that even so, John distinguished between his interpretations and Jesus' words. Those are the asides. Now, my fourth category I want to show of internal evidence is a unified personality. There are several unified personalities in the Gospels. Peter is a really good example. He is argumentative, he's loving, he's impulsive, he's stubborn, he's a little bit annoying, all of these things all at once. But we find this unique and recognizable combination in multiple stories across the Gospels that are found in different Gospels. So, for example, we only find the foot washing in John's Gospel. And what do we find? Peter is arguing. He's saying, no, don't wash my feet. He's horrified because he loves Jesus so much and he honors Jesus so much that Jesus would wash his feet. And then Jesus says, I have to wash your feet or you have no part in me. And then he argues again. He says, okay, then my head and my hands also. He can't just let Jesus do what Jesus wants to do. That's unique to John. But only in the synoptic gospels, not in John, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find him arguing when Jesus says, I'm going to die. Okay, I'm going to be crucified. And he pulls Jesus aside and says, no, God forbid, you're never going to be crucified. Why? Because he's warm hearted, he's loving, he loves Jesus so much. But he's also argumentative. He can't just leave Jesus alone. He has to argue with him, and Jesus rebukes him very sternly. We find this unique personality in Mark. Peter says, let's build 3 tabernacles for you and for Elijah and for Moses. That's at the Transfiguration. And in Mark, specifically, it says he did not know what to say. Well, what other disciple, if he didn't know what to say, would say something? Usually, if you don't know what to say, you don't say anything. But Peter, of course, that's what he's going to do. And his is not the only unified personality. I just want to mention we find a unified personality of Jesus across the Gospels in stories unique to all the Gospels. We find a unique personality and unified personality of Thomas in the Gospel of John. We find unified personalities of Mary and Martha in story in Luke and then stories in John. So that's not just Peter. But before I finish here, I want to talk about contradictions. Because when you talk about gospel historicity and gospel accuracy, for sure, someone is going to say, but what about all the contradictions? There are so many contradictions, and you may be intimidated. Unfortunately, I hear Christians, Christian scholars, Christian authors, Christian apologists saying, let's not try to defend the reliability of the Gospels when we're talking to unbelievers. Because if we do that, we're going to get sidetracked. We're going to get taken off onto what they call rabbit trails. Um, and we're going to get bogged down because people are going to say, what about all the contradictions? Well, I don't agree with that. I think we should be defending the reliability, even when we're arguing positively for Jesus' resurrection and for the truth of Christianity. Let me just point out here, when you're making a presentation, such as a 30-minute presentation, or like you're in a debate and you have your opening statement, you decide what order you put things in. Nobody can force you to go off on a rabbit trail. That's your decision. Nor do you have to say, let's grant this, let's grant all these contradictions to avoid a rabbit trail. You can just say, well, right now I would rather not address this for this moment. I will come back to that later, or something like that. That's not granting anything. So I just want to point that out. Um, but also, I do not like that way of speaking. All the contradictions, that word all, so many. If you categorize them, if you categorize alleged contradictions and you don't treat them as all equally difficult or as having to be understood one by one by one by one, you will not feel like they are so many that you feel discouraged by them. I just posted something about this on my Facebook profile. Um, I don't know if you have this game in all of the places where you're listening to me from, but there's a game called Whack-A-Mole that we used to have, where you have a hammer and these moles are popping up from holes and you have to hit them each on the head. And if you miss any of them, you lose. You should not treat this as a game of Whack-A-Mole. Okay. Instead, you should put them into categories. And now I'm going to illustrate what I mean by that. First big category, entirely fake alleged contradictions. And you really need to learn to see this because it will increase your confidence greatly. First category of that, alleged contradictions that involve weak and obvious arguments from silence. There are so many of these. So, an example, Bart Ehrman, the skeptic, loves to do this. John has the I am sayings, but the synoptics do not. Well, why not? This means that Jesus didn't say them, he'll be arguing. Because why else would they be absent from the synoptic gospels? It's not a contradiction. The fact that one gospel has something and another gospel doesn't does not amount to a contradiction. There are strong arguments from silence in the world. For example, I look around my room right now and I do not see a dragon. That's a pretty good argument from silence that there is not a dragon in my room, because dragons are very large and very hard to miss. But the absence of the I am sayings from the synoptic gospels is not the absence of a dragon in my room. There could be all sorts of reasons why they didn't include them. We should not assume that they approached their task saying, how can I include the strongest evidence that Jesus claimed to be God? There are also implications in scenes in the synoptic gospels that Jesus did claim to be God. So this is just a weak argument from silence. It's not a contradiction. So that's an entirely fake contradiction. Here's another kind. Entirely fake contradictions that arise from overreading. An example here, were there two donkeys or one donkey at the triumphal entry? Mark, Luke, and John, here it crosses over the difference, the synoptics and John. They never say that there was only one donkey. They do mention that Jesus rode a colt donkey in the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. But mentioning the colt is not the same thing as denying the mother. Only Matthew mentions both the colt and the mother. But you're overreading the synoptic gospels if you think that they're saying that there was only the colt. And you'll hear this, catch it, be ready to catch it when skeptics do this. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, say that Jesus rode a colt, that there was a colt there, but Matthew says there was the mother there. And so Matthew says there was one, but Mark, Luke, and John say there were two, as if Mark, Luke, and John say there was only one. That's overreading. Another example. I've seen this one. This is an actual example. You may be astonished. You may think that this can't be a real example, but it is a real example. In Mark 4:34, and this is echoed in Matthew, it says that Jesus spoke many parables, and he did not speak to the people without a parable. Without a parable, he did not speak to them. Okay. And I've actually seen this interpreted as if it means that Jesus literally never opened up his mouth to teach the people, to teach the crowds without telling a parable. And then they'll say, it's another attack on John. It's pretty suspicious. It's pretty strange, or it's pretty ironic that we don't find any parables in John. Makes you think, And then vaguely, somehow, it's supposed to cast doubt on the historicity of John. But of course, it doesn't mean in Mark that Jesus literally never gave a long teaching to the people without telling a parable, right? It's referring to it. First of all, it's a hyperbole. And second of all, it's referring clearly to the immediate context because Mark has just finished a, a, a long section of teaching that's one parable after another. So apparently, on that occasion, Jesus mostly spoke to them by telling one parable after another on that occasion. Okay, but this is just an overreading. Okay, now we want to move on. I'm afraid I'm going to go over time here to alleged contradictions that can be legitimately harmonized. So I don't want to say these are entirely fake because these could appear concerning to begin with. But it is entirely legitimate to harmonize them, and that's not a problem. Harmonization gets a very bad reputation. Skeptics, and again, unfortunately, some Christians will imply that you must have a conservative Christian bias if you ever harmonize contradictions. And they will refer to any kind of harmonization where you have to use what I call real world imagination as strained harmonization. Well, strained harmonization exists, but many harmonizations that they call strained are not strained. In fact, we harmonize in looking at witness statements all the time. A real world example is in a real world example of two witnesses concerning a robbery. One witness said um, the the robber, when he went away, he ran away on foot, and another witness said he jumped into his truck and drove away. And it turned out that one witness was just looking out of one part of the window and saw him running across the parking lot. And the other witness was looking out of another part of the window and saw him get into his truck. That's real world harmonization. And that really happened. That's an example given by former cold case detective J. Warner Wallace. So, an example in the Bible, Mary Magdalene's movements on the morning of the resurrection. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here because I want to save time for question and answer. But I just want to emphasize that people who are in a group don't always stay in that group. The Bible is talking about real people. Real life is like a series of videos, not a series of snapshots or a series even more of carvings, like sculpture. And people are treating the movements of the women on the morning of the resurrection as being like a sculpture in stone or something. So if Mary Magdalene is with the other women, when she comes to the tomb, she has to stay with the other women. Uh, and then you say, well, in Matthew, a group of women see Jesus when they're leaving the tomb, and they've already seen the angels and they're joyful. Um, and then in John, we have that wonderful scene where Mary Magdalene comes back with Peter and John, and she's alone and she's weeping and she meets Jesus. Well, did Mary Magdalene meet Jesus when the women were joyful and they were all together after they saw the angels, or is Mary Magdalene meeting Jesus when she's alone um, and she's weeping? Well, the latter. She met him when she was alone and she was weeping. The women who met Jesus on the road were not with Mary Magdalene anymore. She had already run to tell the other disciples. It's not a desperate, conservative, wild, strained harmonization. When you spell it all out, you see that it's very plausible, and there are many like this. And now I want to mention alleged contradictions that remain puzzling. Now, once you recognize the other categories, you will not be intimidated anymore, and you will see how we really can't be confident, and especially once you assimilate much of the positive evidence for historical reliability, and these will end up being far fewer in number. We do have some apparent discrepancies between the accounts of truthful witnesses who are close to the facts that we don't necessarily know how to harmonize. That's actually the texture, what I call the texture of witness testimony. So it may be that the Holy Spirit allowed there to be these apparent discrepancies that we don't know how to harmonize, because that really shows us that we're really getting witness testimony. It also shows some degree of independence. If the authors were just using each other as sources, they would have smoothed out those alleged discrepancies. So let me give an example of this. Here is my last bit of content. Did the centurion come in person to see Jesus, as he appears to do in Matthew, or did he only send his messengers, as he appears to do in Luke? Now, I find this an alleged discrepancy that remains puzzling. I'm not satisfied with any of the harmonizations that I've seen. Matthew really does appear to be quite explicit that he came in person. In fact, when Jesus says, "Go, let it be unto you as you have believed," that word "go" is in the plural. Or excuse me, I misspoke. Um, it's singular in Matthew, as if he's speaking only to him. But um, Jesus speaks to the messengers in Luke in the plural. So it appears in Matthew that he's speaking to the centurion alone. At that point, the centurion's really there in person, but Luke emphasizes that the centurion did not come. Okay, so that's hard to resolve, but it's one of a few that are like that. Now, if you're a traditional inerrantist, the usual thing to do in these cases is to set out some possible solutions and then just say, we don't know. And that's a completely legitimate thing to do. We don't have to know the answers to everything. Okay. And you can just hold out for some additional information that we just don't know. If you are in that space that I showed in the Venn diagram earlier, where you affirm reportage, but you're not a traditional inerrantist, you may suggest that these remaining cases are those where a minor good faith error has occurred. But in my judgment, there are no cases in the Gospels where the most reasonable explanation is that the author knowingly changed the facts, and that would be incompatible with the reportage model. So I wanted to talk about alleged contradictions, but put those against the backdrop of all of that amazing positive evidence, and you will see things as if from a height. You will see the case as a whole in a holistic manner that gives you confidence in historical accuracy. For more information, and I do invite this, you can see my 3 books. These are all available in Kindle so far. So um, that might enable you to get them more easily and more inexpensively. Um, I have a page, Lydia McGrew Author, on Facebook where I post about this kind of thing. You don't need to be my Facebook quote unquote friend to follow me. Um, and I keep my Facebook friends list very short. But I can be messaged even if you're not my Facebook friend, or messaged at Lydia McGrew Author. I have a YouTube channel where I try to put up content as I am able every week on these topics, philosophy of religion and the Gospels and Acts. And this same content in audio only is published to Anchor FM and other podcasting platforms if you prefer just to listen. You can write to me with a question. If you still have a question, try to keep it to a specific question, and be sure to introduce yourself a little if you write, because that helps me just to know the audience, know my audience. Okay, so at this point, I'm going to mute my microphone, and we'll take a brief break, and then we'll come back for some question and answer. Thanks so much for listening.